My name is Agáta Šústovou Drelovou. I'm a researcher at the Institute of History, Slovak Academy of Sciences, and here with me in the studio is Professor Philipp Ther, Professor of Central European History at the University of Vienna, and the author of critically acclaimed Europe since 1989 and New Order in the Old Continent. Professor Ther, what is your understanding of 1989? We know that it was both global event with global consequences. So what is your understanding of the globality of 1989?
First, I would like to stress that, of course, it was a Czechoslovak event. And I happened to be in Prague in the beginning of November in '89, and then again in December. And of course, I have a very good and positive memory of the revolution and its main values. Lidskost, in Slovak, of course, slightly different. Lidskost, human dignity, democracy, solidarity, and I think this should always be remembered. On the global level, 1989 has a different component and probably also a different meaning. In 1989, there were key changes on a global level. Now, to start with that, actually, we need to go even back to the year 1988, to Chile. Chile pursued a neoliberal reform strategy with a very radical privatization, liberalization, deregulation, and betting on foreign direct investment. So something which we know from the region of Central Europe from the 1990s, and in Slovakia, of course, especially from the years after 1998 under the Dzurinda government. So this was kind of tested already in Chile. And this was then the foundation of a first, we can say, neoliberal success story. So that Western observers kind of thought that first comes the shock therapy, or radical reforms, neoliberal reforms, of course under different conditions, because Chile was not a planned economy, but nevertheless it was a major change. And first this wide-ranging, deep reforms, and then you have high growth, GDP growth, and prosperity. So this is basically the nutshell of the Chilean success story. And then there's a second component, because indeed these reforms pushed growth in the 1980s in Chile after the resolution of the Latin American debt crisis. Then Pinochet, the dictator, tried to profit from that. And he put up himself, or another presidential term, for a plebiscite in 1988. Of course, he expected that he would win, and in this way he would gain democratic legitimacy. Well, then he lost, but that then caused, so to say, a change in government. And so in 1989, what occurred in Chile was yet another democratization, the rise of democracy. Samuel Huntington wrote a book titled The Third Wave of Democracy. So this was not only based on Eastern Europe, but on the Latin American experience primarily. And in a way, this was the foundation of the myth that radical neoliberal reforms, more economic freedom and unbound market economy would eventually lead to democratization. And this was then translated to Eastern Europe, and there was this expectation in transition studies that there would be a double transition. That's the title of an article published by Jeffrey Sachs and David Lipton in 1990 about Poland. So their expectation was that there would be a double transition from the planned economy to a free market economy, and from a dictatorship and authoritarian system to a liberal democracy, which then Fukuyama used in his triumphalist end of history. The Western system would be victorious and prevail, so to say, forever. So this is the broadest story. Then there's another important aspect about the global 1989, which was the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus was a meeting between representatives of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, representatives of US Congress, Finance Ministry, and they kind of codified this radical reform strategy in Latin America. And they then developed this document, the Washington Consensus, which has 10 points, like the 10 commandments, and they consist of, one can say, reduce it to 5 major points. The first one is macroeconomic stabilization. Almost always that meant an austerity program. Then privatization, liberalization, deregulation, and then there's a final important point, foreign direct investment. So the promise of global capitalism, and you can say an externalist modernization. Now, this Washington Consensus took up the experience of Chile, of Bolivia, of other Latin American high inflation, high debt countries, so it underwent radical reforms. But then it was turned into a blueprint for the reforms in post-communist Europe. And the first case where a variant of the Washington Consensus was implemented was Poland. Poland was a high inflation, hyperinflation, and high debt country in 1989. And so the father of the Polish reforms, Leszek Balcerowicz, looked for international support of the debtor countries and also for a reform program. Of course, the Polish reform program, the Balcerowicz plan, was his own creation, but nevertheless, one can see many parallels. On the formal level, again, a 10-point program, but then also in the ingredients. Again, you find austerity or macroeconomic stabilization, which is of course not the same, but that's what was implemented. Then you find privatization, liberalization, a degree of deregulation also that was rather mixed. And then again, the hope for foreign direct investments, so for international global capitalism. And if you look at the political setup in Poland, the support the Balcerowicz plan got, not just from liberals like himself, but also adherents of social Catholic teaching, for example, Ksiądz Tischner, or then the left wing of the Solidarność, parts of the left wing like Jacek Kuron, then we can speak about a Warsaw Consensus. And that was then the Polish reform plan. Now, this was, you can say, a Polish product, but it had this international context and background. And what was then very important is again the international reception. The Polish shock therapy also had various side effects, not only social ones, but also economic side effects. Lack of demand because of decrease of purchasing power, which was criticized by economists back then. Also the Polish shock therapy was touted as a great success, by the way, until very recent times, until 2014. Now, I don't want to deny that it brought certain positive economic results. Nevertheless, this kind of simplistic reading, this simplistic causal correlation, first comes the shock therapy, then comes growth and prosperity. That is also a part of this global story of 1989 and kind of, in certain ways, a repetition of the Chilean success story, which then had a huge impact on the whole region. So shock therapy was then copied for the Russian Federation and even for previous laggards like Slovakia, who then adopted radical reforms. So this is then, again, this global dimension of 89 then had, above all, repercussions in Central and Eastern Europe.
So where does populism come in?
Well, populism existed always. By the way, the term was above all important for Latin America, but also in North America there was something like populism long before, in the beginning of the 20th century. And there are special publications about that. Now, there's different variants of populism. In the early 1990s, most important was back then a more left-wing or post-communist populism, condemning the liberal or then neoliberal reforms, attacking the reform elites, and arguing that well, there needs to be more of a social equilibrium, that the welfare states should be strengthened. But back then also arguing in, you can say, a post-communist nostalgia, that socialism was not all bad, and that there should be maybe something like a third way, but anyway, a stronger welfare state. And also a different reform course, a more gradualist. And these social promises were given, for example, by Vladimir Mečiar here in Slovakia, and he won the elections in '92 with that. In Poland, SLD argued for that, won the elections in '93. In East Germany, there was the PDS. So you have a bunch of parties who basically had, one can say, a socially populist program, a left-wing populist program, and then won elections with it. Now, in recent years, the populism we have encountered was a different one. That's a right-wing populism with a very nationalist platform, and one can say kind of a set of protectionist promises. So protection from economic competition. That's why Trump and the Brexiteers argue so much for tariffs and start trade wars. So against this aspect of globalization, protection from labor market competition. So they always argue against migrants and of course also against refugees who are perceived as illegal migrants. Then the protection of national values and of a traditional family setup, so a traditional division of labor in terms of gender. The male breadwinner and the woman staying at home with the kids. So this is basically this kind of setup of protectionist promises coming from the right. Orban proposes things like a peace in Poland. And now, talking about populism, in recent years there was also a competition between right-wing populists and left-wing populists in several European countries. And right-wing populists almost always won this competition. Slovakia might be a special case because here you have an originally left-wing populist party, Smer, reacting to the Zorinda reforms, originally left-wing, but then having a more and more right-wing program over the years, also arguing against migrants, against too free of a market. So there is a mixture. Populism is always a blend of different demands and ideas.
What do you think is the remedy for the rise of populism?
Oh, this is so difficult to answer. If we would have one, then, moderate left liberal politicians or maybe even left politicians would win all over the place if we would have an easy recipe. I think it is very difficult to counter, but Slovakia has set an example. I mean, the election campaign of your state president, of Ms. Čaputová, it was based on a very simple message, decency. Now, this had a very specific context. The mafia murder of the investigative journalist and his wife, and high-level corruption on different levels. So obviously there was an anti-populist revolt because there was too much right-wing populist corruption. Corruption is a permanent feature of all populist governments, by the way, also in Austria. I mean, we are confronted with a huge amount of corruption at the moment, and we can only hope that this will be unveiled and that the, corrupt right-wing populists, but also some other politicians will be accordingly punished. We need to see whether they will be a success in that. But anyway, so there was this specific Slovak context and counter-reaction. On a more broader level, we can only hope that Slovakia will set an example also in terms of political strategy. I mean, one is to have a good counter-candidate. The counter-candidate, the non-populist, needs to have a reasonable and convincing program, which your president obviously had. Hopefully there will be political parties taking the momentum in the parliamentary elections. But maybe also you need to have a popular mobilization. I mean, this is also a component of the Slovak revolt after the murder of Mr. Kuciak, that tens of thousands and even more people went out on the street and demonstrated. And that is another issue, how to create this mobilization, but then also how to keep it up in that it is not watered down and also demobilized in a multi-party competition and in a probably dirty election campaign. I think this is the key issue. And hopefully Slovak politicians and parties can set an example again. In Austria we have had our elections and the right-wing populists lost because of the corruption scandals. But again, I think it is important to keep up the momentum for the future. Unfortunately, we don't have an 89 tradition where people can be mobilized in this way, but it exists in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, in parts in East Germany, and in United Germany. And I hope that indeed that there will be convincing counter-programs, because that is, I think, the key issue. There's all this finger-pointing against the right-wing populists, but the more urgent question, I think, is democracy is about the competition. So why don't liberals or moderate left politicians, or maybe even mainstream conservative parties, why were they not able or had only limited success, let's say that, to develop convincing competitive programs? That, I think, is the key issue.
Thank you very much for this interview, Professor Ther.
You're welcome. Thank you for the interview.